Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. In this video, we're going to go over the fetch API in JavaScript together. Now, similar to the previous video where we learned about NPM, which is the Node Package Manager, technically speaking, this API is not really part of JavaScript. It is a web API, which I'll get into as we go through this video. However, similar to NPM, and even more so actually, it is such a central part of working with JavaScript and the web ecosystem that I couldn't help but include it because we're going to be using it for literally everything as we go forward, both on the back end and the front end. Okay, so I'm super excited to go through this API in depth with you. Let's just get right into the concepts. Okay, so to start off, I want to kind of go through what is this fetch API before I go through a diagram kind of explaining these concepts in a bit more depth. So to start, I just want to say that this is a API, which is another way of saying a bunch of code, a collection of functions and methods that are built in for us technically to different parts of the language, in this case into the web specification. However, it's being implemented in pretty much every tool that we use, including Node.js to some degree, **, which I'll mention at the end. However, it is a built-in web standard API for fetching resources. Now, this is purposely vague, right? What the heck does fetching resources mean? Does that mean like going to the local 7-Eleven and grabbing some candy, right? No, not really. Fetching resources is similar to that, but the digital version, right? So I have a diagram prepared shortly to go through what this fetching resources idea means. So just keep that at the back of your mind until we get there. The most important part here is that it's a web standard API. Now that is absolutely crucial as we go forward working with JavaScript, because things that are in the web spec means that we can rely on that being there for us all the time in pretty much every environment that we work in JavaScript with, and it's always going to be the same bit of code and work the same way. Okay, so the next thing that this API provides us with, or set of functions provides us with, is this idea of a request, a response, and then headers. Okay, we're going to be working with all of these, and I'm going to go through them in depth shortly. Technically, this fetch API builds on top of this older spec called the XML HTTP request. Wow, what a mouthful. Try to say that 10 times in a row if you can as a tongue twister. But this is a really old school spec that actually still exists in the language, and we can still use it. And there are technically some really edge casey things that it can do that fetch can't do. However, pretty much for 99.9% of the stuff that we need to do, fetch is going to work much, much easier for us. So just know that this fetch API is just building on top of this, if you may see it in different bits of code or in other people's projects. Now, the important part I do want to mention, which I hinted at earlier, was that this fetch API is available in most JavaScript environments, like the browser, Node.js, and others. Throughout this course, we've been using Node.js to run our JavaScript code. We can also run JavaScript in the browser, right? So like Chrome and Firefox and Safari and things like that. And we're going to be doing that more when we get to front-end concepts, okay? Which is working with things like the DOM and React and other technologies like that. Up until now, we've just been focusing on the core JavaScript language. Now, the important part here is this most that I've starred. Technically speaking, fetch is a web API, and it's not actually part of the language, okay? The browser implements it by default, pretty much guaranteed. Node.js, however, does not. This is not true recently, so if you're running versions of Node 18 or higher, which I'll show later on, now they've finally included it inside of the Node.js kind of standard, so we can just use it without any extra NPM installing. However, I'm going to show a way to actually kind of bring this bit of code in, the web API for fetch specifically into Node if you're running previous versions of Node like 16 or earlier, for example. But that said, it's such a central API that even in newer versions of things like newer than Node, for example, Dino, actually have fetch built in, and we don't actually have to do anything fancy to get it working. There are many other reasons why fetch is super important to learn, and I'll kind of hint at them throughout this video. So before I show you an awesome drawing, hopefully you think it's awesome as well as to how this all works, I just want to pull up Chrome real quick. I'm going to pull up Google, and I just want to search for web APIs. Okay. Now, hopefully one of the first results you get is my favorite resource, which is MDN, or Mozilla's Developer Network, and they have an entire page dedicated to the web APIs. Let's go ahead and open that. So when you open that, you'll get to a page like this. And what this is a bunch of functions that have been pre-built and put into the web standard. This means that we can rely on these working consistently across operating systems and across browsers for the most part. Now, it's up to browsers to implement these separately. So for example, super bleeding edge brand new features might not be rolled out right away to older browsers. However, generally speaking, most of these things are implemented in most browsers. Now, if we scroll through this list, I encourage you to definitely read through this. This is fantastic reading material, by the way. If you like reading these like before you go to sleep, it's a good way to put yourself to sleep. Haha. If I go down here, fetch API, right? So under F, we have the fetch API, and then we have the file API as well. So we, in this video, are interested in the fetch API. Now, this is if I click on this, it is a set of what are called like interfaces or functions that allow us to fetch resources. So I encourage you to read this when you do get a chance. It is a bit more interesting and it's a little bit dry, but after you see the concepts in this video, it should make more sense. We're specifically going to be focusing on these things down here, which are the actual interfaces. All right. Now, let's go back to my slides here, and I just want to show you what this whole fetching thing is all about. I'm super excited to go through these concepts in excruciating detail once we get to things like building our own APIs. But for now, I'm going to kind of gloss over the surface, and I promise you we'll get back to the more complex and underlying features of this in future videos once we actually build our own APIs and understand things like how the internet works, how servers work, how databases work, and all that kind of fun stuff. But for now, let's focus on it at a high level. Now, imagine we have this story, right? We have you and I sitting over here. Okay, we're at our computer. Now, I don't know why the computer is so small, but please bear with me. Maybe your computer is this small, but mine is definitely almost as big as I am, I guess. So it's quite big. But let's just go with this picture. So let's say that we have a question. Okay, and our question is, can I get a cat picture right now? Okay, this is a pretty common question. I've definitely asked this question many times, and I hope you have too. If not, definitely pull up Google and look for cat pictures. They're super cute. But let's pretend that we want to ask this question, maybe for the first time, for example. Okay, so what we could do is we could go to Google and we could ask for a cat picture. Okay, so the process of actually doing that is actually quite complex. There's quite a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes to get us that cat picture, right? So let's kind of walk through this step at a high level just to see how it actually works so we can understand what it means to actually fetch a resource and really get an appreciation for what the fetch API is actually doing for us behind the scenes. So let's come back here. This is us. We're going to go to Google and we're going to be like, cat pictures, please, right? And I like to say please to the computers. I like to say please pretty much to everything. So hopefully you do too. So let's just say we say cat pictures, please. That is going to be a request. Very similar to in English, how if I was to go up to someone and ask them for a cat picture, or go up to a store and ask them for a cat picture, I would say, hey, I am requesting, please, a cat picture from you. Right? Now, maybe not in that in those words, that'd be a bit odd, but generally speaking, that is what a request is, right? It's a question. We are requesting something. We're requesting some resource or some answer. Okay, so that's the way to think about a request. We're going to make this request over this nebulous thing called the internet, right? We're going to go over everything regarding the internet in future videos, as I mentioned, and how all these servers talk to each other and the routing and how we actually get packets moving back and forth. Super fun stuff. I really can't wait to get to those, but one step at a time. So for now, let's abstract that idea and just pretend that we are talking over the internet, whatever that is, which is a bunch of servers somewhere that we have no idea. And it's eventually going to land on the other side as a request still to, in this case, if we're asking Google, it's going to land up on Google's servers. Now, what the heck is a server? We're going to go again into much more detail on this in future videos, but a server is basically what you see in this picture. It is usually a bunch of computers that are kind of custom made and stacked on top of each other in order to kind of facilitate responses to requests that they get. Okay, they're basically just computers and a whole bunch of them in a room, right? If you've ever been in a server room, it's super, super cool. They have awesome cooling systems and a lot of wires everywhere and fancy lights and stuff. I hope I can do maybe a tour and show all of you one day of a server room specifically with all these racks. But generally just think of an entire room of these computers. Now, our request is going to land on one of these computers because when we ask Google for a cat picture, we're technically talking to an address. We're talking to google.com. And the internet knows how to get to google.com's address on this interwebs idea, and eventually it's going to land on one of these servers. Now, this server is going to kind of respond to this request. Now, we can get a whole bunch of responses. In this case, let's just pretend that it finds a cat picture for us and is very, very happy. Okay, so it's like, here you go. We found you a cat picture, right? So I have one for you, and here we go, right here, right? This beautiful image of, in this case, a background. Let's pretend it's a cat. The terminology for this is a response, as you might expect, right? So if I went to a shopkeeper or I went to a friend and I requested a cat picture, they would respond with, hey, Nader, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you want a cat picture from me right now? Or they would oblige and give me a beautiful cat picture, right? Hopefully the latter. So in this case, we would also get a response, but this time instead of from our friend, for example, it would be from our server, which in this case, I guess is also our friend because they're giving us a cat picture. That picture, that response with the picture inside of it, kind of attached, is going to travel back through this nebulous internet, this cloud of networks, and it's going to make its way back to us as a response. And our computer is going to take that and basically give it to us. And in the case of Googling something, for example, in an image search, it would actually display it for us as well on the screen so we can take a look. Okay, so probably way more detail than you ever wanted as to how to get a cat picture online. But I could actually probably go into 10 times more detail for you, and I would love to in future videos, but for now, let's just cap it off there. So when I talk about fetching a resource, at the back of your mind, this picture should pop up. Right? Request to something that has a resource and then a response back to us. Maybe it has something in it. Maybe there's an error. Maybe something bad happened along the way, right? But we're going to get back some response with something inside of it for us. Okay, cool. So let's move on from here. So this set of interfaces, as I showed you, is basically made up of these things. The fetch API is basically this stuff right here. 4 kind of key things. This is the main one that we're going to be working with. Okay, it's the fetch function itself, and we're going to be using this repeatedly over and over and over again to do everything regarding fetching resources on the internet. However, we can actually provide extra things to this in order to actually make it work differently in different ways. We can provide these things called headers. We'll get into this in future videos as well, especially when we work with things like the front end, where we can make different kinds of requests to the resources and maybe ask different kinds of questions and customize them in specific ways. We can even customize the responses in specific ways. Now that said, we have the request object, which is that kind of first part where we're making the request to a resource, and then we can have a response, which is what comes back from that request to the resource. The request and response, usually we don't have to deal with ourselves manually. Usually they're generated for us. However, we can create them manually if we want, very similar to headers, but that's a bit more advanced and we're not going to do that in this video. We're going to focus on this one up here, which is fetch. Okay, so let's actually take a look at how this works. That was a whole bunch of yapping, but I hope it made sense. So this is how the fetch API works at a very, very basic level in code. we're going to create a variable. In this case, I'm going to call it response. And we're going to point at the result that comes back from calling the fetch function with a URL in this case. A URL is just very similar to what you type in your web browser, like www.something.com, for example. However, we need to make sure to include the protocol, which is the part at the start. Usually you'll see this hidden in a lot of browsers. However, some of you might have seen this before, usually like http:// or https://. We can't forget this because the Fetch API uses this to figure out where to go for the address. Our browsers usually insert this for us automatically behind the scenes. But when we're working with code, we have to be very, very explicit with what we want the code to do. So we actually have to tell it manually, please do the HTTPS stuff. Now we'll get into those protocols in future videos again, as I mentioned, but for now, let's just assume that that's what we need to do. Okay, and this is the resource location. Now, what's interesting is if we log out this response, and we'll actually see this in code in a second, we will get back a pending promise. Okay, so the Fetch API returns to us a promise. Now that's super, super important. I want you to think about why that is for a second. Okay, think back to the promises video if you have seen that. If not, I'll link it as to why this has to be a promise. Okay, give it a shot. So the answer is that when we do this, right, when we do this stuff, when we ask a question to some remote resource, that is not something that is instant. That is something that might take some time. It might be very, very fast, right? It might be a few milliseconds or a few hundred milliseconds. However, in computing terms, that is actually an eternity because the amount of code that we can run while that request is off in the internet land and waiting for a response, we could run a whole bunch of loops. We could make a bunch of arrays and objects. We could do a whole bunch of cool stuff. And then when that response comes back, we can deal with it then. Okay, so that is why it's a promise. It is something that's going to happen in the future, and it's going to be pending until it either resolves or rejects that promise with our response. Okay, perfect. So let's kind of take a look at this. But before we do, I just want to show you an example website that we're going to be using. So I'm going to pull up Google again. This is a little bit risque because I hope I don't get any strange images pop up that might not be totally appropriate for this video, but I'll give it a risk. What the heck? So I'm going to search for Wallhaven. Okay, this is a fantastic wallpaper website. Their website is wallhaven.cc. Okay, so if I click on that, I will get this website right here. Okay, I can zoom out a little bit and we can see that I have a whole bunch of wonderful, wonderful wallpapers, right? So we scroll through these wallpapers and you can kind of take a look at them yourself and download some if you like. Now, in future videos, we're probably going to be using this to learn topics like web scraping, for example, or downloading certain types of resources, which is super, super fun. But for now, this is just kind of a fun, practical example to see how we can actually use Fetch. So if you think about this, this is wallhaven.cc. Okay, and it's an HTTPS website, which is why we have the lock. So if I go to VS Code, let's actually see if we can talk to that website from Node.js. Okay, so we're going to have to do a couple of things. I'm going to create a new file here. I'm going to call this fetch.js. Now, I would like you to pull up your terminal, and if you run node-v, that should tell you the version of Node that you're using. You can see I'm using a slightly older version, 16 point something. Now, if you have something 18 or higher, you technically don't need to install using npm the Fetch API. However, if you're below 18, you do need to install it because it's not bundled by default. In web browsers, it is already bundled by default, and a lot of things that succeed Node, it is included by default as well, like Dino, for example. However, we're not going to go there for now. We'll save that for future videos. So let's just focus on Node.js. If you're on a version lower than Node, or if you just want to follow along, it doesn't hurt. Even if you're on version 18 or higher, let's actually install Fetch for Node. Okay, so I'm just going to pull up my web browser. I'm going to pull up another Google tab. I'm going to search for npm, which we've seen recently in the npm video, npmjs.com. I'm going to go there. I'm going to type fetch. And I'm going to press enter. And the one that we're going to be interested in using is this one right here, node node fetch, a lightweight module that brings the fetch API to NodeJS. All right, so let's go ahead and click that one. This is node fetch, lots of weekly downloads, as you can see. To install it, we can run npm install node-fetch. So let's do that. I'm going to create a package.json file really quick. I'm going to do npm init-y. There we go, package.json. So I'm going to open that up just so you can see that that's in here. Once we have that, I'm going to do npm install node-fetch. And there we go. So you can see that that added the dependency of node fetch to our project, and it's version 3.3 or higher. I'm also going to do one more thing in here. I'm going to, in our package.json, add a type module. This is so that we can use ES modules, which allows us to use the import syntax instead of the CommonJS require syntax. Perfect. Now, inside of fetch, we are going to import fetch. So if I go back to my npm, if we scroll down a little bit, we will see that we can use ES modules here to import fetch from node fetch. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to import fetch from node fetch, just like that, node-fetch. Okay. So if I do a console.log of fetch just to make sure I actually have that function, let's see if we get an error if we run this file. I'm going to run node fetch.js and awesome. Okay. Async function called fetch. Okay. So this by default is installed, as I mentioned, on 18 and higher. So technically, if you don't have this line, this would actually work and it would be defined globally. And this is true in the browser as well. However, in Node.js versions 16 or lower, we do need to actually import it, and there's no harm in even doing it on a higher version. Okay, perfect. So let's see what we can do. If we go back to Wallhaven here, what I want to do is I want to kind of ask Wallhaven for now, to keep things simple, can you kind of talk to me? Can you talk to me a little bit, right? I'm going to kind of make a request to you, right? And I'm going to just ask you for your web page. Okay. So similar to when we go to wallhaven.cc and we press enter, that's doing the same thing, but the browser is handling that detail for us behind the scenes. So in code, we can actually do that manually by doing a fetch to wallhaven.cc, and we will get back the web page. Very similar to this situation right here. That's kind of automatically done behind the scenes for us in the browser. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to just get rid of this console log for now. I'm going to say, let's fetch. And inside of fetch, we're going to give it a URL, the resource URL. So let's not forget the protocol, HTTPS for secure, www.wallhaven.cc. Okay. Now I want to store this response somewhere, which is going to be a promise. So I'll just say const response is equal to calling this fetch. Let's just console.log out that response. I'm going to clear out this console and we run this fetch, and you can see that we get a pending promise. Okay, so that's interesting, right? So something happened, we shot something off into the ether, into the cloud, and we got back this pending promise. Okay, so what can we do with pending promises? Well, we can do a .then on them, right? We can also put this into an async function and actually use await as well, but for now, we'll just use vanilla promises just so that we can see how it works at that level. So if I want to make this work, I can then say response.then. I'm going to get back some, let's just say, result for now. Let's just call it result, okay? And we've done this in the promise video as to how these .thens work and promises work and promise chains work. If I console.log out this result, not response, result, let's see what we get. So if I run this, node fetch, and I get this gigantic thing. I know it's cut off by my wonderful head here, but let me scroll up to the top. You can see that we get back a response object. It has a size of 0 and then a bunch of stuff. You can see that these are symbols, which we looked at in the symbols video. And this looks like there's some internals, some body, something. And there's a whole bunch of other zeros and ones, looks like binary or something crazy, and some text in here. Okay, I can see that there is some interesting stuff, right? This is a URL, a status, apparently some kind of headers, which we kind of looked at a little bit. But this is all kind of gobbledygooky looking. Okay, so what I want to show you next is a little bit of the internals of this, given that we're going through this in depth. To start, what I want to do is actually show you all the keys inside of this result object. Okay, so to do that, we're actually going to use a different type of loop that we have not seen yet in our JavaScript video so far. I purposely did not include this loop because there are very few cases where it's actually useful. And in fact, it's actually kind of dangerous sometimes if you don't use it correctly. But in this case, it's a good example of where we could use it. So we're going to use a for const key. And instead of, we're going to use the in keyword, which works with objects. Now, this is tricky because it actually includes the object's prototype, which we haven't really learned yet and which we'll go into in future videos. So for now, just bear with me while we actually take a look at this, and we'll definitely cover this in detail in future videos. So we're going to loop through the result and its prototype and console.log out all the keys. Perfect, just like that. Okay, so be aware that this is the in keyword, which works with an object, unlike of, which works with an iterable. Okay, so now if I take this and I run it again, what we're saying is that response object that comes back, loop through every single key in it, including its prototype, and then log out that key value for us. So if I run this, what we'll see is this list of keys. Okay, we have a size, type, URL, etc., etc., etc. Then we have these things at the end, like body and body use and all that kind of fun stuff. Now, if I go back to my Chrome and I pull up the web API and I take a look at the response, right? So if you go back to the fetch API documentation, or you just search for the response in JavaScript for MDN, you'll end up on this page. If you scroll down, what we'll see is some of these things that we just saw. There's a URL, there's a type, there's status. And if we scroll down a bit further, we can see that there's blob and JSON and text, right? So this kind of matches all this stuff that we see here. Now I want to kind of take this out for a second. I'm going to comment that out. And I just want to show you something even crazier. Now, I don't recommend you do this for most things, but I really want to show you this because this is an in-depth video as to how this actually works in the prototype. So if we console.log out the result, but then we ask for the result's prototype properties using the dot and then underscore underscore proto, P-R-O-T-O, and then underscore underscore. So there are two underscores here, proto, P-R-O-T-O, and underscore underscore again. So this is a secret hidden property on what's called the prototype. Now we're going to get into this in future videos, but for now, I'm just going to show you what this looks like. So if I run this, what we'll see is that this is the body of the response and it has these things on it. There's a type, URL, status, OK, redirected, status text, and headers. These are apparently getters, whatever those are, which we'll cover in future videos on things like classes. Then there's this clone thing. So this is some of the stuff, but not all the stuff. Like where is the other things in there, like the some of these functions that we were just looking at, JSON and text and things like that. I don't see that on here. So I'm going to copy this line one more time, and I'm going to look for the prototype again. I'm going to do dot underscore underscore proto again. Now this is totally crazy. If you're looking at this and you're like, what the heck, Nader? I get you. I totally do. I would not recommend you do this. This is just so you understand really what's happening and the prototypes and where these are located inside the response object. So if I run this one more time, what we'll see is this is the first prototype and this is the second prototype. And in here, we have what we're actually interested in, which is the body use, and then most critically, these ones, the array buffer, blob, JSON, and text. Now, what's interesting about this is that these are async functions, which means that they return promises to us, okay? So we can't just call text or JSON and kind of log it out because that's going to be a pending promise. We actually need to either await it or use .then on it, okay? So for now, let's kind of think about how this works. We are making a request out to wallhaven.cc. We're getting back a response. We're logging the response right here. The result is what we're calling it, okay? Now this comes back after like a second, for example. The way that the fetch API works is that it doesn't assume anything about the body, which is the actual content. Okay, it allows us as developers to actually figure out what to do with that content. We're going to look at this shortly, but let's actually quickly log some of these out first, just to take a look and take a peek at what's happening. So if I I'll comment this one out right here, the proto one, and we'll just look at this one right here. I'm pointing at my screen. I should probably use my mouse and just log out some of these just so we can take a look. So if I console.log out the result, and I can do .url, for example. Okay, I'm gonna do a few of these. We'll do result.status, result.ok, and result. Let's go with headers even. Okay, I'm gonna clear out my console. I'm gonna run this one more time, and it looks like what we get is we get our prototype right here, which we saw. This one here is the URL, which is line 11. This is the status code, which comes back, which is 200. We'll go over that in future videos as we work with status codes. Okay is true, whatever that means. That I guess means that we're okay and everything is good, a thumbs up. And then we get back the headers object, which is this crazy looking thing with a whole bunch of weird stuff in there, which we'll also have to go through in future videos so that we keep this one relatively short. But there's just some extra metadata in there that we can use if we need. Now, if we come back to this idea of the actual instance methods, which are JSON, text, form data, blob, and array buffer, we know that when we talk to Wallhaven, we are interested in the HTML that comes back. Okay, when we make a request to this URL right here, specifically this URL, that is asking for that web page. We are not asking for an image. We're just asking for the web page, otherwise known as the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript that make up that web page. In this case, it's just the HTML. Okay, we're going to go over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in future videos once we get to the front-end technologies. But for now, you just have to trust me that that is all just plain text. Okay, it is literally just a gigantic string. So what do I mean by that? If we go back to Google Chrome and I open up wallhaven.cc, if you right-click anywhere on the page, and this option might change depending on which browser you're using. I'm using Chrome. If you're using Firefox or Safari, it might be slightly different. It might be inspect element, for example, or it might be some other kind of option. In this case, actually, I realize I'm looking for view page source. I believe it's view source on Firefox and maybe view source on Safari. If maybe someone can comment in the comments to kind of make that a bit more clear for people, I'd really appreciate that. But if I right click and I do view page source, okay, I'll get this crazy looking web page. And I'm just going to zoom in on this a little bit. I'm going to tick on this line wrap option in Chrome, at least on the top left, just so you can see this. And now I'm showing you the actual HTML for this web page. Now you're kind of thinking probably, what the heck, Nader, again? Why do you keep messing with me? Like, what is all this gobbledygook? Right? And I get you. I agree. This probably makes no sense. Eventually, we'll probably get to understand some of this. But if we actually look closely through this, specifically the white text, we can probably see some things that are interesting. We see awesome wallpapers. That's definitely plain English. Wallhaven.cc. That's pretty cool. It looks like there's some weird looking JavaScript code in here. I don't know what that does. It looks kind of weird. The best wallpapers on the net. Wow, amazing. We see top list. We see latest. We see upload, random. We got Arknights in here. Look at that, cats, amazing, my favorite, right? We got cats in there, landscape, etc. Right? So these are coming from this page, right? Latest, top list, and some of these words, cats is right there, right? That's all data that exists in the HTML on this web page. Okay, so how do we do that but through Node? So we need access to that text. So let's take a look at what happens if I do this. I'm going to do a console.log of the result.text. Now this is a function. So we need to call it using brackets because we saw that text, if I go back to here, it returns a promise that resolves the text representation of the response body. This is a function. This is not a property. So we actually have to call this function. So I'm going to do that using the brackets. I'm just going to kind of get rid of all of these comments here. So the only thing happening inside of my promise.then clause is this result.text being logged out. So if I run this one more time, what we see is we get back a pending promise. Okay, so that is kind of interesting. That kind of makes sense. We kind of expected that. So let's see if we can do a couple things. I'm going to do this the weird way first, and I'm going to kind of clean it up a little bit to make it a bit easier to understand. So I'm going to say const text is equal to result.text. Then I'm going to say text.then. Then I'm going to get the like HTML, I guess. And inside of here, and I appreciate that this is a lot of brackets all over the place, but just bear with me for now. We'll clean this up. Then I'm going to console.log that HTML. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're grabbing the text, which is a promise. And with a promise, we can do a .then. So we're going to put a text.then HTML and then console log. Now note that this is all inside the .then of the actual response. So first we get the response, the result. Then we're going to ask to convert it to a string and print it out. And that's also a promise. So now if I run this, check it out. Look at that, right? We get back what looks like a string of HTML, right? Look at this. We have awesome wallpapers, wallhaven.cc, right? We have the best high quality wallpapers on the net. I bet there's cats somewhere in here if I was to actually take a look, but this is a bit hard to read, right? There's some JavaScript in here. There's a whole bunch of stuff. There's some placeholder searching. There's some Arknights again. I bet we're close to cats somewhere in here, right? That's pretty awesome, right? What we just did, I just want you to sit and just appreciate for a second, because this is pretty wild. We literally are opening up an entire world of possibilities for us, where we're able to reach out over this internet and talk to a server. Who knows where the server is, right? It's probably somewhere across the world. And it's giving us back this HTML. This is what our browsers do for us day in and day out behind the scenes. But when you actually code it, it just feels really, really nice. Okay. I can't wait to actually do things like web scraping in future videos and just get deeper into this concept. But I'm going to contain my excitement to keep this video short. Now, you're probably looking at this and being like, oh my gosh, like what the heck is this? Like, I kind of get this, but this is pretty ugly. So one way to clean this up is to actually convert this text right here into a kind of a nicer version of itself. So I'm going to comment that out just so you can see it as a reference. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to return the result.text here instead. Now what this is going to do is it's going to return a promise from this .then function. And as we saw in the promise video, we can actually do promise chaining, where if we return a promise from another promise, we can actually do a .then on it again. So here I can do a .then again, and I can do the same thing. I can say take the HTML, and then we're going to console.log out the HTML. And we can kind of flatten out this promise chain a little bit, because first what happens is we get this. Once we get that, then we go here and then we get this. And if I kind of clear out this console and I run it one more time, we get back the exact same result. It's just cleaned up a little bit. This is definitely a little bit easier to read, and we will be using this syntax a lot because it lines up really nicely with the await syntax as well once we actually turn it into an async await function. So that said, I do want to quickly convert this to an async await function just so you can see how that might actually work. So if I do this, I can say I have to create a function. I'll just say const fetch data, and this is going to be an async function. I'm going to kind of scroll down a little bit here. I'm going to copy this fetch call right here. I'm going to copy this fetch call. I'm going to come here. I'm going to say const response is equal to fetch, right? But since we're inside an async function, we can actually use await here, right? And now this is going to be pretty much this result right here, right? So we covered this in the promises and async await videos. Then I can say const text is equal to await response.text. Now this is slightly different because technically what's happening here is if I was to really turn this into this exact version, I would want to call this kind of result, and then this would be the result. And the response is kind of implied in here because we're actually getting this result back, and then we're calling .text on the result, which is what's happening right here. And then we're taking that and we're logging it out. So in this case, if I actually change this to HTML, that would actually be pretty much the exact equivalent. So if I console.log out the HTML, this code right here is the exact same as this code right here with the with this response right here as well. Okay, so if I want to make this work, I'll have to do a fetch data, and I have to call this function because this is just declaring the async function. I'm actually just going to comment out this one right here, just so that we only see this code working. And if I run this, what we'll see is the exact same response, just using the async await syntax right here instead, if you prefer that. The only difference is that we actually have to call it, but over here we can use the vanilla syntax with .thence. Okay, we're not handling errors right now, and we totally should. However, we'll do that in future videos as we get deeper into working with fetch. All right, so I kind of skipped ahead a little bit, but effectively what we did was we pretty much went through this. We saw how we get back the response object, and we can actually work with that. But this doesn't kind of go far enough with the fetch API, because the fetch API assumes nothing about the actual response. So we actually have to tell it to do something with that response. And in this case, for example, here, we can do something like text and turn it into a string. Now that probably begs the question, well, how do we do other types, right? Is it just a string? Like, what about images and things like that, right? So it turns out that there are many different types of response types, and this is why fetch is built the way it is. It doesn't actually assume anything about the actual response. These are the most common types of responses that fetch supports. JSON, which is short for JavaScript object notation. We're going to be using this a lot with APIs. Text, which is what we just worked with, which is basically a gigantic string like HTML. Blobs, which are binary data, so you can think of this like an image, for example. Form data, and then array buffers, which are a bit more niche, and we're not going to be using them too much at all. So we're going to focus on these ones right here. JSON and text definitely use a lot. Blob is for things like images and video and music and things like that. But when we work with APIs, we're usually going to use JSON or sometimes text. Today, we just saw the text version. All right. Now, I do want to mention that technically we used fetch like this. We can also add an object to the second argument in fetch. The second parameter right here after fetch, it can technically be an options object. Okay, and inside of the options object, we can do things like include headers. We can tell it like what kind of request method it is. We can include like different like messages and things like that. We can include a body. We can include all sorts of things inside of this to make it super, super robust, because by default, this is just a simple what's called a GET request to this URL and some default headers. But we can actually do pretty much anything, including things like uploading things to a server or sending pictures to a server and things like that. And we're going to get into that in future videos. Now, I do want to mention kind of one thing when it comes to the fetch API. One really, really common thing that people do when they first start using JavaScript is they start defaulting to other libraries. So if I just go back to NPM really quick, now I search for Axios, A-X-I-O-S. Now, this is a pretty common library that a lot of people use when they start working with Node.js. Now, I am going to highly suggest that you use the fetch API pretty much exclusively unless you really need the features of Axios, which, as I mentioned, is very, very unlikely and only probably like 0.1 or less % of the time. The reason for this is that fetch is included by default on pretty much every single web platform, like Node.js's new versions, Dino, all the new versions of that, and then specifically the browser as well. And this gives us huge advantages because when we want to work on really, really brand new bleeding edge technologies, like for example, working on the edge or edge functions, we are not going to have access to modules that we can npm install, for example. They're usually very slim and they work on the core JavaScript APIs, and usually fetch is a part of that. Even though it's not part of the official JavaScript spec or language, it is usually such an important part of JavaScript's kind of ecosystem that it's included as one of the core APIs for a lot of these environments. And as you start using fetch, you'll get a better appreciation for kind of all this stuff, right? Around responses, headers, requests, and how all they work and integrate with each other. And you'll just naturally start learning about the web itself and HTTP and kind of all that fun stuff as you go. Now, that's not to say I'm like poo-pooing too much on these libraries like Axios. They're great when they're needed. However, I think it's really, really important, and it goes a really, really long way if you really stick with the standards and really build stuff kind of not really from scratch all the time, because these are built on other tools. But if you stick with these standards, they're robust enough to actually deal with everything we need day to day for the most part. And if you really need to reach out for those tools, then you can reach out for them in those specific use cases. All right, so I know that was quite a lot to absorb. Like, this is quite a crazy amount of stuff that's happening all at once. But I just want to kind of wrap this video up back with this wonderful picture. I love this picture. I really could wish I could draw these pictures like all day for all of you. I think that fetch is absolutely a must know when it comes to JavaScript. We're going to be using it everywhere across the stack as we continue with this series, front end, back end, and everything kind of in between. Once we get better with this, it's really going to amp up our skills with JavaScript, and it even helps us understand other concepts like how the internet works in general. So I hope this was a useful video for you. If you did appreciate this video, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. In the comments, I'd love to hear, do you use these other libraries? Do you use fetch that much? Which one do you like more? Did you kind of know a lot about how it works behind the scenes, or is a lot of this new? Did you understand this concept of servers or databases and requests and responses? Or was most of that hidden when you're using some other libraries? I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on that. What we're going to do in the next video is we're going to go over some exercises for fetch, which is one of my favorite things. Eventually, we're going to get good enough with this set of APIs that we can do things like web scraping, for example, or building all sorts of automations. But we're going to start slow, take some exercises together and actually work through them. And after that, we're going to get to an actual project finally for this part of the series before we start getting to really more of the advanced stuff in JavaScript. So we're going to be able to practice more things like the fetch API together. I can't wait to see you there in that video with the exercises. I'll see you later.